It's starting to feel good to watch Russia lose so badly. In 2026, we've seen a complete momentum shift. Sure, Russia is still trying to push, trying but failing. What we're seeing now is Russia losing faster than it ever has before, a staggering 16 times faster as the grand spring and summer offensive has sputtered to a near halt and Ukraine just keeps inflicting losses. Putin can't afford to carry this on for much longer. Russia is already at its breaking point, but the big question still remains: why is Putin sacrificing so many soldiers for so little? You'll find out soon. First, some numbers. In its July 1st Russian offensive campaign analysis, the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, revealed that Russia had so completely failed to achieve any operationally significant goals in its June offensive that it only managed to capture 30.43 square kilometers of Ukraine. On the one hand, this is good news for Putin. Russia is in the black again. That result comes on the back of 2 months where Russia experienced net territory losses, as a rampaging Ukrainian counteroffensive liberated territory in several key regions. But on the other hand, it's 30 square kilometers. And when compared to what Russia achieved in June 2025, that is a pitiful amount. Even Russia's gains of 481 square kilometers a year ago are pretty sad. That's practically nothing in return for the massive offensive that was happening at the time. But what we've seen in June 2026 is so much worse, 16 times worse in fact. That's how much less territory Russia has managed to gain in June 2026 compared to the same month last year, and it's indicative of a failing Russian offensive that was stopped before it ever got off the ground by Ukraine. But it gets worse, so much worse. We told you that Russia is losing its offensive momentum 16 times faster than last year. What do we mean by that? The answer is found in a brutal mix of grinding delays and skyrocketing casualty rates. According to data from the Institute for the Study of War, Russia's territorial advance has slowed down by a staggering 16 times. But here's the real kicker. While their progress has crawled to a halt, it's costing them 16 times more blood for every kilometer they managed to take. Back in June 2025, Russia lost an average of 68 soldiers for every square kilometer it captured. But in June 2026, despite suffering a staggering 39,490 casualties, they gained almost no ground, meaning they are now losing a record-breaking 1,298 soldiers per square kilometer. Putin is still trying to trade blood for land, but Ukraine has forced the price up 19-fold on an offensive that is running 16 times slower. This is insanity. It's certainly unsustainable, and it's not like Russia has sacrificed all of these soldiers to edge its way toward a breakthrough. The ISW points out that the majority of Russia's advances in 2026 so far have occurred in Konstantinivka, which is the southern anchor of the formidable Donetsk fortress belt. Gains in that city accounted for 77% of everything that Russia managed to take in its pathetic June campaign, and when counting infiltrators, Russia has boots on the ground in 37% of the city. The percentage is much lower when we take infiltrators out of the equation and only account for parts of the city that Russia outright holds. Bear in mind that Russia first entered Konstantinivka in October 2025. About 3/4 of a year of fighting has yielded about a third of the city, if we're being generous. But what all of this means is that Russia is essentially stuck in a stalemate at the southern tip of the fortress belt, and it's paid a massive price in blood just to get to that position. Putin will be livid. He'd set a deadline of September 2026 for the collapse of the entire fortress belt, yet his soldiers are still toiling away in one of the 4 cities that make up this belt, and they're barely advancing in that city. Putin thinks he has a solution for all of this. That September deadline, make it December 31st. That'll surely be enough, right, Putin? An extra few months for an army that is making progress at a crawl so slow it would humiliate a sloth is going to somehow accelerate to the point where it collapses the entire fortress belt in the next 6 months. There's only one word for this: foolish. Still, it's only the 15th postponement of the Donetsk deadline. Jesus Christ, Putin, you set 5 of these deadlines in 2022, 2 in 2023, 2 in 2024, and another 3 in 2025. Now you've added 3 in 2026 after you said March 31st and September 1st. Anybody else would have looked at that failure rate and seen that maybe, just maybe, Donetsk is a hard nut to crack and that Putin's deadlines mean absolutely nothing. As for Ukraine, it compounds every Russian failure that we're seeing with a strike campaign that adds to Moscow's misery. That campaign, which has seen Ukraine accelerate its deep strikes on Russian territory and introduce middle-range strikes into its arsenal in 2026, is doing enormous damage to the machinery that supports Russia's attempts to advance. Again, the numbers for June are huge. We saw Ukraine pull off 303 middle-range strikes against Russian targets in June, which is 93 more than the total in May. Russia lost 12,867 fuel vehicles and fuel tanks during the month, which is 4 times the number that it lost in June 2025, along with 2,053 artillery systems versus 1,243 in June 2025. All across the occupied territories, Russian logistics are being disrupted, which wears down frontline troops who are trying and failing to make meaningful advances. In Russia itself, June saw Ukraine hit oil infrastructure and military targets across 41 different Russian federal territories, including in Moscow. Many of these territories now face fuel shortages, as does Crimea, which is being isolated from the Russian mainland and occupied Ukraine in a brutal campaign designed to kick the occupiers out of the illegally annexed peninsula forever. This is what 2026 really looks like for Putin and his invasion of Ukraine. A woeful rate of advance in Ukraine and a country that is on fire because Ukraine has developed a capability that Putin arrogantly assumed it would never have. Still, the only way from rock bottom is up, right? Oh, Putin, as if you thought you were at the bottom yet. Yes, somehow it gets even worse for Russia than it already looks from everything we've shared so far. In a July 1st report, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, revealed that the costs of Putin's war against Ukraine, both in manpower and money, are ballooning out of control. And all of this is happening as Russia's offensive devolves to the point where it's now one of the slowest ever in the last century of warfare. The CSIS says that Russia has suffered an estimated 1.4 million casualties in a campaign that has still only taken about 20% of Ukraine's territory. Most of these gains were made in the early months of the war, and the 20% figure also includes Crimea, which Russia stole in 2014. Of the 1.4 million casualties, up to 450,000 are estimated to be what the CSIS calls irreversible losses, which means they've been killed in action. Many of the wounded will never be able to return to battle, at least not in any meaningful capacity. According to CSIS, these types of figures are unprecedented in the modern era of war. We're going to explain why in a moment, but before we do, this is a quick reminder that you're watching The Military Show. There's a lot more where this comes from, so don't forget to subscribe if you're getting valuable insight from our channel. So CSIS ran some comparisons between Russia's Ukraine invasion and the outcomes of other modern military endeavors. The results were not what Putin wants to hear. Russia's casualty rate in Ukraine alone means that it's suffered 4 times as many losses as the US military has experienced in all the wars it's fought since World War II. That includes the brutal conflicts in Korea and Vietnam, which both took massive tolls on the US and, in the case of the latter, failed to achieve America's objectives. Russia in Ukraine is doing 4 times worse than over 80 years of American fighting. What will really sting Putin is that the man who is so desperate to return Russia to what he sees as the glory years of the Soviet Union would be pilloried for his complete and utter failures by the very leaders whom he wishes to emulate. Russia's losses in Ukraine are 9 times higher than the combined Soviet and Russian losses since World War II. We'll repeat that, 9 times higher. If Putin wants his legacy to be restoring Russia to the days of the Soviet Union or any other of the supposed glorious periods in Russian history, then he's failing. And things simply won't get better for Russia. United 24 media reports that Russia is losing between 30,000 and 34,000 soldiers per month in 2026. Throw June's figures into the mix and you get a casualty rate that is veering far too close to 40,000 for Russia's comfort. These losses aren't being replenished by new contract soldiers. Russia is recruiting volunteers at a rate of 27,000 per month, which means that Ukraine is whittling away at Russia's manpower advantage with every passing month. In some areas of the front lines, Russia is now losing 8 soldiers for every 1 that Ukraine loses, the CSIS adds. And the rate of advance across key areas of the front is glacial. In Konstantinivka, which you may remember from earlier, Russia is pushing forward at a rate of 50 meters per day. Not kilometers, meters. Most people could run that distance in 10 seconds or less. In Pokrovsk, Russia moves forward at a rate of 70 meters per day, and its best performance is in the Slovyansk sector, with a rate of 90 meters per day. We haven't seen numbers like these since the Battle of the Somme in World War I, and that's not something Putin should take pride in. Ukraine's drone advantage is really starting to pay off here. CSIS says that Ukraine's use of AI-powered and autonomous systems is playing a huge role in the Russian failures that we're seeing all over the battlefield right now. It's an especially big reason why we see that 8-to-1 casualty stat mentioned. Putin is still trying to push his soldiers forward while Ukraine is mastering the use of AI drones and autonomous weapons that allow it to keep its soldiers away from the front while still inflicting massive casualties. Russia is trying to respond with an AI push of its own. According to a July 3rd Pravda report, Russia has begun the mass deployment of AI-equipped drones in Zaporizhia, which is an obvious concern, even if it has come months after Ukraine has amassed a massive stockpile of AI drones to batter Russia. But it's looking like too little, too late for Russia. Ukraine's drone advantage keeps on growing. On the front, Ukraine maintains a 1.5-to-1 numbers advantage when it comes to FPV drones. Ukraine is also capable of matching Russia drone for drone and often exceeding Russia's numbers with its long-range attacks. And as Russia struggles to get to grips with AI in drones, Ukraine is developing drones that can be launched from practically anywhere. We see that in the Sea-Babe, a maritime drone that was once and is still used for kamikaze attacks against Russian vessels, has also been transformed into a launch platform for FPV drones that can be used to strike targets in the Black Sea and Crimea. The cost of all of this to Russia is simply unsustainable. We see that already in the recruiting numbers. At an average of 27,000 volunteers signed up per month, Russia is over 12,000 short after its disastrous June. But we also see it financially. Russia's approach, which has seen it attempt to break Ukraine down through attrition, has fallen apart now that drones are responsible for up to 90% of battlefield casualties. Now, as The Independent reports, Russia is on course to run at least $28 billion over its projected annual budget due to spiraling war costs caused by its massive rate of losses. Russia's war spending reached a new record level during the first quarter of 2026, as it spent $83.2 billion on the invasion, which is roughly half of Russia's total budget. Back in April 2025, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky was already claiming that Russia had spent $1 trillion on the war. Add a little over a year's worth of spending to that figure, and Russia is likely closer to $1.5 trillion spent than it is to $1 trillion, based on these quarterly figures. Russia is losing badly. Though Putin's forces have managed to turn the tide to make the slightest gains in June, those gains are coming slower than ever and at far too great a cost. And that brings us back to the question we posed right at the beginning of the video. Why is Putin sacrificing so many of his soldiers in return for so little? Part of the answer comes down to the fact that what we're seeing in Ukraine is the traditional Russian way of war, albeit a warped version of it that includes the constant sacrifice, but isn't returning the sorts of gains that Putin would have expected. Mothers will produce more sons, is how Geneva Solutions puts Russia's approach to war, and it's right. For centuries, Russia has engaged in war by simply sending soldier after soldier into battle, knowing that the manpower advantage it brings to the field will eventually be enough to overwhelm the enemy. Almost all great Russian victories are tinged with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of casualties, as a culture of self-sacrifice for the greater good is taken advantage of by leaders like Putin. Russia's big problem in Ukraine is that it's no longer fighting a war where sending meat into the grinder until the grinder clogs up will work. Drones have changed all of that, especially now that Ukraine has autonomous drones that enable it to protect its soldiers while still inflicting massive casualties on Russia. Still, Putin is rigid. A Soviet-minded man out of place in the 21st century, still believing that the traditional Russian way of doing things will get the results that he wants. That's part of the reason why Putin isn't stopping his ill-fated invasion. But behind this fatalistic traditionalism lies a much bigger reason. Putin simply can't afford to lose in Ukraine, so he will fight on until he wins or he's gone. To understand why it looks like Putin has lost his mind to the point where he seems willing to sacrifice all of Russia to get his hands on Ukraine, we need to look at how Russia's leader views his great enemy. Putin is desperate to secure his legacy by, at the very least, planting the seeds for a new Russian empire. Ideally, that empire will be achieved while he still lives. Ukraine was supposed to be the starting point for all of it. One of Putin's warped justifications for his Ukraine invasions is that Ukraine is part of Russia's former empire, stretching back to the era of the Tsars such as Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. The words "the Great" have a nice ring to them for Putin, and there is something in his broken little mind that seems to make him believe that he might earn that moniker if he is able to subjugate Ukraine. In his essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, Putin made this case by arguing that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, rather than two separate nations that have distinct cultures and histories. Putin is wrong about so much of history. That doesn't matter. He truly believes that he's doing what's right, both for Russia and his legacy, and that makes Putin a very dangerous man. So dangerous that he will keep sending soldiers into Ukraine until there are none left. It's win or bust for Russia in Putin's mind. But even behind the so-called historical justifications, Putin also realizes that it's win or bust for himself in Ukraine. Putin is trapped. He's coming to grips with the likelihood that Russia can't win in Ukraine, at least not during his lifetime. But he also knows that he has to put himself in a position where he can't afford to lose. For decades, Putin has done an excellent job of shielding himself from regime change, be it through taking control over Russia's oligarchs or restricting the information flow inside Russia so that Kremlin propaganda rules all. But now he's losing control. Over 4 years of fighting haven't yielded what Putin promised, and Ukraine only seems to be getting stronger. When Muscovites are watching as Ukraine's drones fly overhead, not even the strongest propaganda can hide the fact that Putin has brought war to his own territory. The only way out for Putin now is to win in Ukraine. A withdrawal opens up dissent, it opens up questions, anger, and opportunities for those who lurk in the shadows, sharpening their knives as they wait for their opportunity to oust Putin and seize power for themselves. Putin has become desperate, and that makes him dangerous, as much to his own people as to Ukraine and the rest of Europe. On July 3rd, The Telegraph reported that US experts have warned Poland that Russia is planning a serious escalation on its territory. Tactically, this might make sense if Russia hadn't churned up so much of its military in Ukraine. Europe has become Ukraine's rear in the sense that it's through Europe that Western weapons flow, and thanks to Ukraine's partnerships, many of the weapons that Ukraine innovated are now produced. Poland, bordering Ukraine, makes it an obvious choice to serve as a through line for all of these weapons, which would explain Putin's interest in an escalation. But this isn't really any sort of tactical masterstroke. Poland is a member of NATO. Putin knows that any escalation on its territory that veers too close to an outright attack will lead to the triggering of Article 5. But he's desperate. Ukraine has proven that Putin doesn't have what it takes to become the great in anything. So his last roll of the dice may be to start a war that will consume Europe, all to hide away from his own failures. If Putin follows through, the bloodshed will only get worse. An exhausted Russian army will be ruined. Ukraine will seem like a picnic in comparison. If Putin can't become the great, he will become the man who ruins Russia by starting a war that will rage beyond his lifetime. What we are seeing in real time is the death of Putin's empire. Piece by piece, that vision of empire slips away from Putin, and it's all Ukraine's doing. The pursuit of personal glory has already failed. Russia is not only weaker than ever under Putin on the battlefield, but its regional and global influence has collapsed. Find out more by watching our video. We dive into the legacy that Putin has really cemented for himself. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show to see more of our coverage of Russia's constant failures in Ukraine. And thank you for watching.